Well, good evening. It's 6 o'clock and it's time for Tales and Cocktails. My dears, I am getting all kinds of messages, one after another. Spectrum is out in your area. This is happening. That I have no idea what's going on. So let's just proceed as if everything's normal, which I hope everything actually is. So anyway, back to my beloved BRAT FARRAR by Josephine Tey. And tonight we're doing part 4. Of course, I'm now getting this trying to reconnect message, but part 4. So Cosset, Thring, and Noble began their investigations, and Bee went back to Latchett's to deal with the problem of postponing the coming-of-age celebrations. Was she to tell the children now, before the thing was certain? And if not, what excuse could she possibly put forward for not celebrating at the proper time? Mr. Sandow was against telling the children yet. The unknown Kevin's verdict, entirely prepared to find a flaw in the so-complete dossier that had been handed to them. It would be inadvisable, he thought, to bring the children into this until the claim had been sifted through the finest mesh. With that, she agreed. If this thing passed, if that boy in the back room in Pimlico was not Patrick, they need never know anything about it. Simon would probably have to be told so that he could be warned against future attempts at fraud, but by that time it would be of no more than academic interest, a quite impersonal affair. Her present difficulty was how to reconcile the children's ignorance with the postponing of the person who rescued her from this dilemma was Great-Uncle Charles, who cabled to announce his long-overdue retirement and his hope to be present at his great-nephew's coming-of-age party. He was on his way home from the Far East, and since he refused to fly, his homecoming was likely to be a protracted one, but he hoped Simon would keep the champagne corked till he came. Great-uncles do not normally cut much ice in the families in which they survive, but to the Ashbys, Great-Uncle Charles was much more than a great-uncle. He was a household word, and every Christmas a tingling expectation by the thought of Great-Uncle Charles's present. There were reasonable bounds to the possible presence of parents, and Father Christmases were merely the answer to indents. But neither reason nor bounds had any connection with presents from Great-Uncle Charles. Once he had sent a set of chopsticks, which upset nursery discipline for a week, and once it had been the skin of a snake. The glory of owning the skin of a snake had made Simon dizzy for days, and Eleanor still ran to and from her bath in a pair of odd-smelling leather slippers that had come on her 12th birthday. At least 4 times every year, Great-Uncle Charles became late. At least 4 times. And when you have been of that first importance 4 times a year for 20 years, your importance is pretty considerable. Simon might grumble, and the others protest a little, but they would without doubt wait for Great-Uncle Charles. Besides, she had a shrewd idea that Simon would not be willing to offend the last surviving Ashby of his generation. And Charles was not rich. He had been far too lamentably off, and Simon, for all his careless good nature and easy charm, was an exceedingly practical person. So the postponement was taken by the family with resignation and by Claire with equanimity. It was held to be a very proper thing that the Ashbys should wait until the old boy could be present. Bee spent her after-dinner leisure altering the date on the invitation cards and thanking heaven for the mercifulness of chance. She wanted this boy to be Patrick, but it would be so much better for all concerned, she felt, if he proved not to be Patrick. 7/8 of her wanted Patrick back, warm and alive and dear, wanted it passionately. The other 1/8 shrank from the upheaval of the happy Ashby world that his return would bring with it. She approved it and was suitably ashamed of herself, but she could not destroy it. And so she was distrait and short-tempered, and Ruth, commenting on it to Jane, said, "Do you think she can have a secret sorrow?" "I expect the books won't balance," Jane said. "She's a very bad adder-up." Mr. Sandal reported from time to time on the progress of the investigation, and the reports were uniform and monotonous. Everything seemed to confirm the boy's story. "The most heartening thing, the assurance," Mr. Sandal said, "is that the young man seems to have had no contact since he came to England. He has lived at that address since the Philadelphia's arrival, and he has had neither letters nor visitors. The woman who owns the house occupies one of the front rooms on the ground floor. She is one of those women who has nothing to do but to sit back and watch her neighbors. The lives of her tenants seem to be an open book to the good lady. She is also accustomed to waiting for the postman and collecting the letters he drops. Nothing escapes her. Her description of myself was, I understand, hardly flattering, but quite touching in its fidelity. The young man could therefore have hardly had visitors. He was out all day, of course, as any young man in London would be. Excuse me. But there was no trace of that intimacy that would suggest connivance. He had no friends. The young man came willingly to the office and answered questions freely. With Bee's consent, Kevin McDermott had sat in at one of these office conferences, and even Kevin had been shaken. The fellow's knowledge of the subject, all good con men are glib, but the general cut of his jib. He's quite frankly not what I expected. After a little while in my job, you develop a smell for a wrong 'un. This chap has me baffled. He doesn't smell like a crook to me, and yet the setup stinks. So the day came when Mr. Sandal announced to Bee that Cossack, Thring, and Noble were now prepared to accept the claimant as Patrick Ashby, the eldest son of William Ashby of Latchets, and to hand over to him everything that was due to him. There would be legal formalities, of course, since the fact of his death 8 years ago had been presumed, but they would be automatic. All were concerned. Patrick Ashby was free to go home whenever he pleased. So the moment had come, and Bee was faced with breaking the news to the family. Her instinct was to tell Simon first, privately, but she felt that anything that set him apart from the others in this matter of welcoming back his brother was to be avoided. It would be better to take it for granted that for Simon, as for the others, the news would be a matter for unqualified happiness. It was after lunch on a Sunday that she told them. "I have something to tell you that will be rather a shock to you," and went on from there. Patrick had not committed suicide, as they had thought. He had merely run away, and now he had come back. He had been living for a little in London, because of course he had to prove to the lawyers that he was Patrick. But he had had no difficulty in doing that, and now he was going to come home. She had avoided looking at their faces as she talked. It was easier just to talk into space impersonally. But in the startled silence that followed her story, she did not recognize him. The shrunk white face with the blazing eyes had no resemblance to the Simon she knew. She looked away hastily. Does it mean that this new brother will get all the money that is Simon's? Asked Jane with her usual lack of finesse. Well, I think it was a horrible thing to do, Eleanor said bluntly. What was? Running away and leaving us all thinking he was dead. He didn't know that, of course. I mean, that we would take his note to mean that he was going to kill himself. Even so, he left us all without a word for, how long is it? 7 years? Nearly 8 years. And then comes back one day without warning. Nice? Asked Ruth. What do you mean by nice? Bea asked, glad for once of Ruth's interest in the personal. Is he nice to look at? And does he talk nicely? Or has he a frightful accent? He is exceedingly nice to look at, and he has no accent whatsoever. Where has he been all this time? Eleanor asked. Mexico and the States, mostly. Mexico, said Ruth. How romantic. Does he wear a black sailor hat? A what? No, of course he doesn't. He wears a hat like anyone else. How often have you seen him, Aunt Bee? Eleanor asked. Just once, a few weeks then. It seemed better to wait until the lawyers were finished with him and he was ready to come home. You couldn't all go rushing up to London to see him. No, I suppose not. But I expect Simon would have liked to go up and see him. Wouldn't you, Simon? And we wouldn't have minded. After all, Patrick was his twin. I don't believe for one moment that it is Patrick, Simon said in a tight, careful voice that was worse than shouting. But Simon, Eleanor said. Bea sat in a dismayed silence. But Simon, Aunt Bee has seen him. She must know. Aunt Bee seems to have adopted him. Much worse than she had anticipated. The people who have adopted him, Simon, are Cossack, Thring, and Noble. A not very emotional firm, I think you'll agree. If there had been the faintest doubt of his being Patrick, Cossack, Thring, and Noble would have discovered it during those weeks. They have left no part of his life since he left England unaccounted for. Of course, whoever it is has had a life that can be checked. Reason can they have for believing that he is Patrick? Well, for one thing, he is your double. This was clearly unexpected. Double? He said vaguely. Yes, he is even more like you than when he went away. The color had come back to Simon's face, and the stuff on the bones had begun to look like flesh again. But now he looked stupid. Believe me, Simon, dear, she said, it is Patrick. It isn't. I know it isn't. You were all being fooled. But Simon, Eleanor said, why should you think that? I know it won't be easy for you to have Patrick back. It won't be easy for any of us, but there's no use making a fuss about it. The thing is there, and we just have to accept it. You are only making things worse by trying to push it away. How did this creature who says he is Patrick, how did he get to Mexico? He left from Westover in a ship called the Ira Jones. Westover? Who says so? He does. And according to the harbor master, a ship of that name did leave Westover on the night that Patrick went missing. Since this seemed to leave Simon without speech, she went on, and everything he did from then on has been checked. The hotel he worked at in Normandy is no longer there, but they have found the ship. It belongs to a firm in Brest, and people have been shown photographs and identified him, and so on, all the way back to England, till the day he walked into Mr. Sandal's office. Is that how he came back? Eleanor asked. Went to see old Mr. Sandal? Yes. Well, I should say that proves that he is Patrick, if anyone is in any doubt about it. But I don't know why there should be any doubt at all. After all, it would be very easy to catch him out if he wasn't Patrick, wouldn't it? All the family. It is a shock for you, Simon, my dear, Bea said. And as Eleanor says, it won't be easy for you. But I think it will be a lot easier when you see him. Easier to accept him, I mean. He is so undeniably an Ashby, and so very like you. Patrick wasn't very like me. Eleanor saved Bea from having to reply to that. He was, Simon, of course he was. He was your twin. If I ran away for years and years, would you believe I was me, Jane? Ruth said. You wouldn't. What makes you think I wouldn't? You would come home in no time at all. Why would I come home? To see how everyone was taking your running away. When is he coming, Aunt Bea? Eleanor asked. On Tuesday. At least that is what we had arranged. But if you would like to put it off for a little, until you grow more used to the idea, I mean. She glanced at Simon, who was looking sick and baffled. Injured a reaction as serious as this. If you flatter yourselves that I shall grow used to the idea, you are wrong, Simon said. It makes no difference to me when the fellow comes. As far as I'm concerned, he is not Patrick, and he never will be. And he walked out of the room, walking, Bea noticed, not very steadily, as if he were drunk. I've never known Simon like that before, Eleanor said, puzzled. I should have broken it to him differently. I'm afraid it is my fault. I just didn't want to make him. He loved Patrick, didn't he? Why shouldn't he be glad about it? Even a little glad. I think it is horrid that someone can come and take Simon's place without warning like that, Jane said. Simply horrid, and I don't wonder that Simon is angry. Aunt Bea, said Ruth, can I wear my blue on Tuesday when Patrick comes? Bea waited until evensong would be over and then walked across the fields to the rectory. Ostensibly, she was going to tell them the news. Actually, she was going to pour out what could withdraw his mind sufficiently from the classical world to focus on the present one. He was a comfortable person to talk to, unemotional and unshockable. Bea supposed that an intimate acquaintance with classic ongoings, topped off with a cure of souls in a country parish, had so conditioned him to shocks that he had long ago become immune from further attack. Neither ancient iniquity nor modern English backsliding surprised him. So it was not to Nancy, her friend, that she was taking her unquiet heart, but to the rector. Nancy would wrap her, but it was not sympathy she needed. It was support. Besides, if she were to find understanding, it would not be with Nancy, who had forgotten Patrick's very existence, but with George Beck, who would most certainly remember the boy he had taught. So she walked in the sunlight over the fields, through the churchyard, and into the rectory garden through the little iron gate that had caused that terrific row in 1723. Very peaceful it all was tonight, and very peaceful were the rival Smiths, sleeping within 12 feet of each other over there in the corner in good clear earth. And on the delicate iron scroll, my trouble too will be just an old song. One must try to keep things in proportion. But it was her head talking to her heart, and her heart would not listen. She found the rector where she knew he would be. Always, after evensong, it was his habit to go and stare at something in the garden, usually at something at the farther end hall to the trivialities of social obligation. This evening he was staring at a purple lilac and polluting the fragrant air with a pipe that smelt like a damp bonfire. There should be a bylaw against pipes like George's, his wife had said, and the present sample was no exemption. It depressed Bea still further. He glanced up as she came down the path and went back to staring. Isn't it, he said. Odd to think that it's just an optical illusion. What color is a lilac when you are not looking at it, I wonder? Bea remembered that the rector had once broken it to the twins that a clock does not tick if no one is in the room. She had found Ruth being surreptitious in the hall, and Ruth, when asked what this noiseless progress was occasioned by, had said that she was trying to sneak up on the drawing room clock. She wanted to catch it, not ticking. Bea stood by the rector in silence for a little, looking at the glory they would not arrange. George, she said at length, you remember Patrick, don't you? Pat Ashby? Of course. He turned to look at her. Well, he didn't die at all. He just ran away. That is what the note meant. And he is coming back, and Simon isn't pleased. A great, round, shameless tear slipped out of her eye and ran down her cheek. She brushed it off her chin and went on staring at the lilac. George extended a bony forefinger and gently speared the front of her shoulder with it. Sit down, he said. She sat down on the seat behind her, under the arch of the young green honeysuckle, and the rector sat down beside her. Now tell me, he said, and she told him. All the bewildering story, in the proper order and with full detail. Mr. Sandow's telephone call, the journey to town, the top floor back in Pimlico, the investigations of Cosset, Thring, and Noble, the rescue by Great-Uncle Charles, the ultimate facing of the facts and announcing them to the family reaction. Eleanor is a little cold about it, but reasonable, as she always is. The thing is there, and she's going to make the best of it. Jane, of course, is partisan and sorry for fire in the flesh. She is a friendly soul by nature. And Ruth? Ruth is planning her wardrobe for Tuesday, Bea said tartly. The rector smiled a little. The happy ones of the earth, the Ruths. But Simon, how does one account for Simon? I don't think that is very difficult, you know. Simon would have had to be a saint to welcome back a brother over who has been dead to him since the age of 13. But George, his twin, they were inseparable. I think that 13 is further removed from 21 than almost any other equidistant points in life. It is a whole lifetime away. An association that ended at 13 has little but sentimental value for the boy of 21. Latchett's has been Simon's for, 8 years. He has known for 8 years that he would come into his mother's money at 21. Would upset a stronger character than Simon's. I expect I did it badly, Bea said. The way I told them, I mean. I should have told Simon first, privately, but I did so want to keep them all on the same level, to pretend that they would all be equally glad. Taking Simon apart and telling him before the others would have anticipated the trouble. Yes, something like that, I suppose. I suppose I had known quite well that his reaction would be different from the others. I had never imagined for a moment, you see, that his reaction would be so violent, that he would go to the length of denying that Patrick was alive. That is only his method of pushing the unwelcome fact away from him. Unwelcome, Bea murmured. Yes, unwelcome, and very naturally unwelcome. You make things difficult for yourself if you don't accept that fundamental fact. You remember Patrick with your adult mind, and are rejoiced that he is still alive. He turned his head to look at her. Or are you? A shade too emphatically, but he let it go. Simon doesn't remember him with an adult mind or adult emotions. To Simon, he is a remembered emotion, not a present one. He has no present love to fight his present hatred with. Oh, George. Yes, it is best to face it. It would take an almost divine love to combat the resentment that Simon must be feeling now. And there has never been anything in the least divine about Simon. Poor Simon. It is a wretched thing to have happened to him. And at the very worst moment, when we were all ready for celebration, at least this is the end. What is that? The fact of Patrick's suicide. I never could reconcile it with the Patrick I knew. Patrick was a sensitive child, but he had a tremendous fund of good common sense, a balance, a far better equilibrium, for instance, than the less sensitive but far more brilliant Simon. He had also, moreover, a great sense of obligation. If Latchet's was suddenly and unaccountably his, he might be overwhelmed to the point of running away, but not unbalanced. Then why did we also unquestionably accept the suicide theory? The coat on the hilltop, the cliff top, the note which did read like a suicide one, undoubtedly. The complete lack of anyone who had seen him after old Abel met him between Tanbitches and the cliff. The persistence with which suicides used that particular part of the coast for their taking off. It was the natural conclusion to come to. I don't remember that we ever questioned it. But it had always stayed in my mind as an unaccountable thing. Not the method, but the fact that Patrick should have taken his own life. It was unlike everything I knew about Patrick. And now we find that, after all, he didn't know. I shut my eyes, and the lilac is no color. I open them, and it is purple, Bea was saying to herself, which was her way of keeping her tears at bay. Just as she counted objects when in danger of crying at a play. Tell me, are you pleased with this adult Patrick who has come back? Yes, I am pleased. He is in some ways very like the Patrick who went away. Very quiet, self-contained, very considerate. Do you remember how Patrick used to turn and say, "Are you all right?" before he began whatever he was planning to do on his own? Didn't try to rush me or take his welcome for granted. And he still keeps his bad times to himself. Simon always came flying to one with his griefs and grievances, but Patrick dealt with his own. He seems still to be able to deal with his own. Has he had a bad time then, do you think? I gather it hasn't been a bed of roses. I forgot to tell you that he is lame. Lame? Yes, just a little. Some accident with a horse. He is still mad about horses. That will make you happy, George said. He said it a little wryly, Bea, with a faint smile for the wryness. It is good that Latchet's should go to a real lover. You rate Simon as a poor lover? Not poor. Indifferent, perhaps. To Simon, horses are a means of providing excitement, of enhancing his prestige, a medium for trade, for profitable dickering. I doubt if it goes further than that. For horses as people, if you know what I mean, he has little feeling. Their sicknesses bore him. Eleanor will stay up for nights on end with a horse that is ill, sharing the nursing 50-50 with Greg. The only time Simon loses sleep is when a horse he wants a leg. Poor Simon. the rector said reflectively. Not the temperament to make a successful fight against jealousy. A very destructive emotion indeed, jealousy. Before Bea could answer, Nancy appeared. "Bea, how nice," she said. "Were you at Evensong? And did you see the latest contingent from our local school for scandalizers? 2 adolescents who are studying the prevalent English superstitions, to wit, the Church of England. A boy, very hairy, 11 combs keeping up her not very abundant wisps. What would you say a passion for combs was an indication of? A sense of insecurity?" "Beatrice has come with a very wonderful piece of news," the rector said. "Don't tell me Simon has got himself engaged." "No, it is not about Simon. It's about Patrick." "Patrick?" Nancy said uncertainly. Uncertainly. "He is alive." And he told her how. "Oh, Bea, my dear," Nancy said, putting her arms round her friend. "How glorious for you. Now you won't have to wonder any more." That Nancy's first reaction was to remember that private nightmare of hers. "You need a drink," Nancy said briskly. "Come along in and we'll finish what's left in the sherry bottle." "A deplorable reason for drinking sherry," the rector said. "What is?" "That one needs a drink. An even more deplorable reason is that if we don't drink it, Mrs. Godkin will. She has had most of the rest of the bottle. Come along." So Bea drank the rectory sherry and listened while George enlightened Nancy on the details of Patrick Ashby's return. Now that her weight of knowledge was shared with her own generation, the burden was suddenly lighter. Whatever difficulty they support and comfort her. "When is Patrick coming?" Nancy asked, and the rector turned to Bea. "On Tuesday," Bea told them. "What I can't decide is the best way of spreading the news in the district." "That's easy, Nancy said. "Just tell Mrs. Gloom." Mrs. Gloom kept the sweets, tobacco, and newspaper shop in the village. Her real name was Bloom, but her relatively known first by the Lettingham and Ashby children, and later by all and sundry as Mrs. Gloom. Or you could send yourself a postcard. The post office is almost as good. That is what Jim Bowden did when he jilted the Haywood girl, sent his mother a telegram announcing his wedding. The fuss was all over before he came back. "I'm afraid we're going to be at the exact center of the fuss until the 9 days' wonder is over," Bea said. "One must just put up with it." "Oh, well," Nancy said, comforting. "Yes, but the situation is so incalculable. It's like, "I know," Nancy said, agreeing, "like walking on jelly." I was going to say picking one's way over a bog, but I think the jelly is a better description. "Or one of those uneven floors at fun fairs," the rector said unexpectedly. "You know about fun fairs, George?" his wife asked. "They had one at Westover Carnival a year or 2 ago, I seem to remember. A most interesting study in masochism." "You see now why I have stuck to George," Nancy said, as she walked with Bea to the garden gate. "After 13 years, I'm still finding out things about him. I wouldn't have believed that he even knew what a fun fair was. Can you picture George lost in compliment?" But it was not of Nancy's George that she was thinking as she walked away through the courtyard, but of the fun fair floor that she was doomed to walk in the days ahead. She turned in at the south porch of the church and found the great oak door still unlocked. The light of the sunset flooded the gray vault with warmth, and the whole building held peace as a cup holds water. She sat down on a bench by the door and listened to the silence. a companionable silence, which she shared with the figures on the tombs, the tattered banners, the names on the wall, the Legion's garish Union Jack, and the slow ticking of a clock. To dignity of the Crusader, to the marble family that wept with ostentatious opulence over the 18th century politician. The Ashbys had no Crusaders and no opulence. Their memorials were tablets on the wall. Bee sat there and read them for the 1000th time. Of Latchets was the refrain. Of Latchets in this parish. No field marshals, no chancellors, no poets, gloricity of Latchets. The small squire, sufficiency of Latchets. And now Latchets belong to this unknown boy from half a world away. A great sense of obligation, the rector had said, speaking of the Patrick he remembered. And that had been the Patrick that she too remembered. And that Patrick would have written to them. Always she came back to that in her mind. The Patrick they knew would never have left them in grief and doubt for 8 years. Some psychopath, and after all, he had run away. A sufficiently unlikely thing for Patrick to do. Perhaps he had been overcome by shame when he came to himself. And yet, that kind child who so automatically asked, "Are you all right?" That child with the great sense of obligation. Tablets in the church at Clare, BRAT FARRAR was standing in the back room in Pimlico in a brand new suit and a state of panic. How had he got himself into this? What could he have been thinking of? He, BRAT FARRAR, how did he ever think that he could go through with it? How had he ever in the first place consented to lend himself to such a plan? It was the suit that had shocked him into realization. The suit was wrongdoing made concrete. And it was a wonderful suit. The kind of suit that he dreamed of possessing. So unremarkable, so unmistakable once you had remarked it. English tailoring at its unobtrusive best. But he stood looking at himself in the mirror in a kind of horror. He couldn't do it, that was all. He just couldn't do it. He would duck before it was too late. He would send back the goddamn suit to the tailor and just duck out of sight. "What?" said the voice. "And pass up the greatest adventure of your life? The greatest adventure that has happened to any man within living memory? Adventure my foot, it's just plain false pretenses." They wouldn't bother to look for him. They would be too relieved to have him out of their hair. He could duck without leaving a ripple. "And leave a fortune behind," said the voice. "Yes, and leave a fortune behind. Who wants a fortune anyhow?" They would have his letter to insure them against any further nuisance from his side, and they would just let him go. He would write to that woman who, because she was kind, and say he was sorry, and that would be that. And pass up the chance of owning a stud? Who wants a stud? The world's lousy with horses. And you are going to own some, perhaps. I may, someday. I may. Pigs may fly. Shut up. He would write to Loading and tell him that he would be no party to his criminal schemes. All that training? I should never have started it. But you did start it. You finished it. You are primed to the gills with knowledge worth a fortune. You can't waste it, surely. Loading would have to whistle for that 50%. How could he ever have thought of letting himself be an instrument in the hands of a crook like Loading? a very amusing and intelligent cook on the highest level of cookery. Nothing to be ashamed of, believe me. He would go to a travel agency tomorrow morning and get a berth out of the country, anywhere out of the country. I thought you wanted to stay in England. He would say temptation. Don't tell me that you're still wavering. He hadn't enough left for a fare to America, but he had enough to take him quite a distance. The travel agency would offer him a choice of places. The world was wide, and there was a lot of fun left in it. By Tuesday morning, he would be out of England, and this time he would stay out and never see Latchets at all. He would find... What did you say? I said, and never see Latchets at all? He tried to think of an answer. Stumped you, haven't I? There must be an answer. Money and horses and fun and adventure are common change. You can have them anywhere in the world. For good. There won't be any going back. But what has Latchets to do with me? You ask that. You with your Ashby face and your Ashby bones and your Ashby tastes and your Ashby coloring and your Ashby blood. I haven't any evidence. And your Ashby blood, I said. Why, you poor little brute of a foundling. Latchets is your belonging place. And you have the immortal gall to pretend that you don't care. Of course I care. But you'll walk out of this country tomorrow and leave Latchets behind for always? Because that is what it amounts to, my boy. That is the choice before you. Take the road of high adventure, and on Tuesday morning you will see Latchets. Duck, and you will never see it at all. But I'm not a crook. I can't do something that's giving a pretty good indication of it these last few weeks. And enjoying it, too. Remember how you enjoyed that tightrope business on that first visit to old Sandal? How you enjoyed all the others? Even with a KC sitting across the table and doing a sort of mental x-ray on you? You loved it. All that is wrong with you now is cold feet. Just cold feet, nerves. You want to see Latchets as an Ashby. You want horses. You want adventure. You want a life in England. Go to Latchets on Tuesday and they are all yours. But you came half across the world to that meeting with Loading. Was that just chance? Of course. Is at Latchets. Your destiny. What you were born for. Your destiny. At Latchets. You're an Ashby. Half across the world to a place you never heard of. Destiny. You can't pass up destiny. Brat got slowly out of the brand new suit and hung it up with orphanage neatness on its fine new hanger. Then he sat down on the edge of his bed and buried his face in his hands. He was still sitting there when the darkness came. And that is part 4 of Brat Farrar. I've been a lot of messages being thrown at me during this, that it was broadcast or it wasn't broadcast. Anyway, my dears, I love this book. I dearly love it. And we will carry on with part 5 next Tuesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. I hope you're enjoying it. I really do, because to me it's a special one. Anyway, thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you next week at 6 for Tales and Cocktails.